Oh hey there, welcome back. Long time no see. Today's video is the first in a two-part series where we'll be covering unit testing asynchronous code in Angular with Jest. Nailed it. This first part, we are going to be looking at testing set timeouts and set intervals. And in the next part, we're finally going to be looking at testing promises. So without any further ado, let's jump into the code. So to start off here, we've got ourselves a pretty standard Angular project. It's got a couple of components and a service for us to write our tests against. And in the interest of keeping this video concise, I've pre-installed Jest and I've actually mocked all of my components in my spec files. Now don't worry if you don't know how to do either of these things. I've got other videos on my channel that help you install Jest and get started with testing and mocking. So just pause this video, jump over, watch those, and then come back here afterwards. So let's start looking at our first component. So if I load this up here, I want to get these side by side so that we can see them both. I'm also going to start my tests and then I'm just going to close these down to give us a little bit more real estate on the screen. So we've got ourselves a pretty simple component here. It takes in a notification and then after a set amount of time, it triggers a method in the service to mark that notification as read. And then we've just got a cleanup method here that makes sure that that timeout is cleared if the component is destroyed. Now in my day-to-day job, if I was writing tests for this component, I'd obviously be aiming for 100% coverage. So I'd be writing tests for these. But as this video is focused on testing asynchronous functions, we're going to start off with this one here. So what we need is a describe block to start off with. And we always give our describe block the name of the method just to make it clear what we are testing. And before we write our first test, I can already see that we need to not mock one thing. And that's this. So let's create a mock for our notifications. We have ourselves a little before each. Once again, I'm whizzing through this part of it because I've spoken about this in my other videos. I'm going to just give this an ID of N1 and I'm going to give it a title. You have a DM. There we go. So we've got that mocked up, ready for us to write our first test. And I think our first test is going to be a really simple one. We just want to make sure that when this set timeout is created, it's mapped to this variable. So we add our it and we say exactly what we want the test to do. So it should map the set timeout to, and then let's just take this variable name. Give ourselves our callback here. Now I like to make sure that whatever we're testing is reset back to a default value at the beginning of a test. So I'm going to go fixture. We're going to take our variable and we are going to set it to undefined. Now the next thing we want to do is we obviously want to trigger our method. So we go fixture.startMark as read timer and then we pass it that notification that we just mocked above. Now as a set timeout just returns a number, all we want to do is we want to expect that our variable, so our mark as read timer, equals, and then we're going to use a little jest helper method here, which is expect any. And basically this is saying we don't know what it's going to return, but we do know the type of it, and we know it's going to be a type number, and that's all we need to know for this one. So our test runner should pass, yep, and usually this would be the point where we can go, yeah, let's jump on to our next method. But we're working with timers and we haven't actually told Jest that yet. And the reason we might want to tell Jest about this is we don't want to use actual timers. We want Jest to have some fake timers that allows us to mock them and also most importantly allows us to clear all timers when we're done with our tests. We don't want timeouts and intervals running infinitely in the background of our tests. So what we do is we use Jest keyword again. And then we tell it to use fake timers. Now I'm going to save that. It won't make any difference to this test, but with our next test, we want to mock the result of this set timeout. So the very next test, I think we want to make sure that when this set timeout returns, it triggers our method in our service. So it should trigger, let's take our method name here and copy and paste it, when the set timeout fires. Add our callback here. So for this one, we actually don't have any setups. We just leave ourselves a blank line. We want to call our method like we did above, and we also want to pass it our mocked notification. And as we've mocked our dependencies, we can just say expect notification service mock dot and find our method there. We expect it to be called with our notification that we've passed in. Now, if I save this, this is going to fail. And the reason for this is, although we've told Jest that we're using fake timers, we haven't told Jest that we want this timer to finish. So we can use another Jest helper method, and that is run all pending timers. As we're only testing a set timeout here, we could equally use jest.runAllTimers, but I like to be a bit more specific and tell it to only run the pending timers. So if I save this, this should make our tests pass. Awesome. And so now we want to write our next group of tests, and these are what I call boundary tests. So we want to add another describe block here. We want to call this our variable name, and then boundaries. And we want to give it its callback. Now, basically with our boundaries, we want to dictate what happens before our set timeout triggers, when our set timeout triggers, and then after our set timeout triggers. So I think we've got three pretty similar tests we need to write here. So the first one is it should not call, take our service method name here, before 3 seconds. We'll give our little callback here. Now, we don't actually need to do any setup here, so we give ourselves a blank line. We then want to call our method like we have above. We want to pass in the mocked notification, and then we expect our mocked service method not to be called. And then I want to tell Jest to run the timer just before it's triggered. So we use advanced timer by, and I'm going to say just under 3 seconds. So if I save that, that should still pass. And then for my next two boundary tests, I'm actually just going to copy and paste this one because they're very, very similar. But for this one, we actually want it to be called after 3 seconds. And then this one, we want it not to be called again after it's been called. So we delete that. So we obviously need to change our timer here, so it's just after 3 seconds, and we want to change this to be called. Now, to be a little bit more specific, I want to tell it how many times it should be called, and it should only be called once. Then we're going to take this and we're going to paste this here and change this to once as well. And I like to use the rule of 4 here, so I'm going to say that after 12 seconds, it should have still only run one time. So if I save this, all of our tests pass there. Now next up, although this isn't strictly an asynchronous test, we want to make sure that that timer is cleared. So our next set of tests are going to be testing our clearup method. And I can only really think of one test that we need to write here, and that is it should clear, let's take our variable name, if it has been set. Now, once again, we need to make sure that our variable is set to the correct value. So if we go here, we're going to go equals. So I'm just going to set it to set timeout with an empty callback, but we have to make sure that we give it a time. So now I want to call our clear down method, which is stop mark as red timer. And then we expect our variable, which I'm going to copy and paste, to be undefined. Cool, and now that's passed, you might think, hey, that's all our tests done, but we've actually missed one important thing. Up here, we've got a before each that tells Jest that we're using fake timers, but it's actually really good practice to have an after each that actually clears down our timers. So after each, and then we want to go Jest keyword again, and then clear all timers. Add our spaces and our semicolon here. And that's that component tested. Next up, if we jump through to the service, and then I want to open the service spec file as well. Let's put that on this side, and we'll close these to keep it clear. In here, we have a few methods, but once again, we're only interested in the asynchronous ones. I can see straight away that we've got a very similar method to the one that we've just tested, but this one uses a set interval. So if we add ourselves a describe block, once again, the name of the describe is the name of the method that we are testing. Give it its callback. And we want a similar set of tests to the ones we've just written. So first of all, it should map setInterval to, and then let's take our variable name, add it here, and then we give ourselves our callback. Exactly the same as before, we want to make sure that this is set to undefined before we test it. We then want to call our method, and then we expect that our variable is now of type number. So fixture dot mark as read interval to equal, and then we have another expect in here dot any type number. And of course that one's going to pass again if we get our tests open up here. In the same way that we tested before, we want to make sure that when our set interval fires, it actually triggers this method. So let's add another test in here. It should trigger, let's take our method name, when the set interval fires. Now before we can check to see if this method's been fired, we actually need to spy on it. So up here, we're going to create a spy. We're going to add ourselves a before each, and then we're going to set our spy in there. We go jest.spy on, tell it it's in this fixture, and then give it the name of the method we want to spy on. And then we want to clean this up a little bit. And now this allows us to write our tests. So we don't need to do any setup in here because we've done that at the top. We want to call our method, and then we expect our new spy to be called. Now I haven't bothered mocking this up because it's actually not important for this test, but in the real world I'd probably mock this in the same way that we mocked our notification in the component. Now we've actually forgotten a couple of important things here. First of all, we haven't told Jest that we're using fake timers. Second of all, we haven't told Jest to clear those fake timers. And then thirdly, we haven't told it to run our timer in this test. So we want to say jest run, and this is one of those occasions, because we're using setInterval, where we need to tell it to run only our pending timers. If we tell it to run all timers and then we save, what we actually get here is a failed test because it's timed out. It's run our interval 100,000 times and it's still not been told to stop. So if we change this back to running only pending timers, what this will do is it will fire the next queued up interval. Then of course we get our pass test there, and that's that test done. Now we want to jump onto our boundary tests like we did before. So we add another describe block. Once again, we take the name of our interval, we chuck it in there, and we say boundaries, and then we give it its callback. Now, similarly to before, we actually want 3 tests here. We want one test to say what happens before an interval is triggered, one test to say what happens when one interval is triggered, and then using our rule of 4 again, we want to say what happens when 4 intervals are triggered. So let's write our first one here. It should not trigger, let's take our method name here, before 5 seconds. Now we can actually take what is written up here, we're going to copy and paste that. We first need to tell Jest how much it's going to advance our timers by, and we want it just before 5 seconds. We then want to tell it that this should not be called, and we'll save that. And not forgetting to add a space up here because we don't have any setup in here. I'm going to copy this and I'm going to paste it twice here. The second one, we want it to be triggered after 5 seconds. And then with our rule of 4, we want this to be triggered 4 times in, and we'll change this to 20 seconds. We'll change this to just after 5 seconds, and then we'll tell this that we want it to be called times, and then we tell it 1 time. In a similar vein, we'll take this, more copying and pasting here. We'll paste this here. We want this to be just after 20 seconds, and we want it to be called 4 times. Let's save that, see if our tests pass. They should do. And they do. And in that, we've kind of covered the basics of timers in Jest. As with all things Jest, there is a treasure trove of timer helper functions. You can find those in the Jest documentation. I do find that some of this is a little bit convoluted, but once you've got the basics down, you can kind of pick out the bits that you need to help you along the way. So that's it for this first part. If you found this video useful, make sure to give me a thumbs up. And also don't forget to subscribe, because in the next part, I'll be showing you how to test promises. Bye for now.